I still remember the day I arrived at Elysium Grove. The place felt like a relic from another time, an old mansion tucked deep in the woods of Maine, far from everything. The drive alone was enough to make me question my decision. A single winding road, barely wide enough for my car, led me through a dense forest that seemed to swallow all light. By the time I pulled up to the iron gates, the sun was setting, casting an eerie orange glow over the sprawling estate. The house, or rather the facility, was massive, with ivy creeping up its stone walls and windows that seemed too small for a building so grand. It looked more like a place where rich families once threw lavish parties, not where broken people came to heal. Still, I had taken the job, and I was here to do it. Dr. Samuel Hayes was the first person I met. He wasn't what I expected. A wiry man with a sharp jawline and glasses that always seemed to catch the light just right. He looked like he belonged in a library, not running a psychiatric program. He greeted me with a curt nod and handed me a leather-bound journal. "For your notes," he said simply. I didn't ask questions. I wasn't here to get too friendly, just to lead the group sessions, write my observations, and maybe, if I was lucky, help a few people. Inside, the mansion was even more unsettling. The long hallways echoed with every step, and the air smelled faintly of mildew, like the place hadn't been lived in for years. My room was small, with a twin bed and a desk that faced a window overlooking the forest. It felt more like a boarding school than a treatment center, but I told myself it didn't matter. The first group session was scheduled for the next morning. I arrived early, settling into a chair in the circle we'd set up in one of the larger rooms. Slowly, the patients trickled in. Ethan was the first. He had a way of looking past you, like his mind was somewhere far away. Sophie came next, clutching the sleeves of her oversized sweater like it was armor. Rachel entered with sharp, wary eyes, her presence practically daring anyone to challenge her. Logan, tall and broad-shouldered, seemed to fill the room with his quiet intensity. And then there was Madison, the youngest, barely out of her teens, her nose already buried in a notebook she carried everywhere. They each took a seat, and for a moment no one said anything, just the sound of creaking chairs and the occasional sniffle. Finally, I cleared my throat. "Let's start simple," I said, forcing a smile. "What brought you here?" It was Ethan who spoke first. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "I hear things," he said. "At night. Whispers. They know things about me. Things I don't even want to know." The room seemed to hold its breath. Then Sophie, her voice trembling, added, "I hear them too. They're not just voices. They're like truths, but they're not mine." Rachel rolled her eyes, but even she didn't seem entirely convinced of her own skepticism. By the time Madison mumbled, "They talk about my mom," the air in the room felt heavy, like we were all sitting under an invisible weight. I tried to steer the conversation back to safer territory, but the unease lingered. That night, as I wrote down my notes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way they described the whispers, it was too specific, too shared. That's when I noticed it. A single line written in my journal in handwriting that wasn't mine. "They know who you are." I froze. The room felt colder, the shadows on the walls darker. I told myself it had to be a mistake, maybe a leftover note from someone who used the journal before me. But deep down, I knew better. This place was hiding something, and whether I liked it or not, I was already a part of it. The next morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. I couldn't stop thinking about the message in my journal. "They know who you are." What did that even mean? I told myself it was nothing, maybe just a prank or some leftover scribble. Still, the unease clung to me as I made my way to the session room. The patients were already waiting when I arrived. Ethan sat in his usual spot, staring out the window. Sophie looked even more fragile than the day before, her eyes darting around the room. Rachel leaned back in her chair with crossed arms, her sharp gaze fixed on me. Logan paced the room like a caged animal, and Madison sat quietly, her pen moving furiously across the pages of her notebook. I tried to start the session light, asking about their nights. It was a mistake. "They were louder," Sophie whispered, barely looking up. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "The whispers," she said, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. "They were louder, clearer. I could almost see them." Before I could respond, Logan cut in. "Same here. I don't know what the hell they want, but they're not just voices. It's like they're trying to tell me something I don't want to hear." The others nodded, even Rachel. "They're in my dreams," Ethan muttered, his voice barely audible. "They tell me things about when I was a kid, stuff I forgot, or stuff you were made to forget," Madison added softly. That caught my attention. What do you mean by that, Madison? She hesitated, her pen freezing mid-word. I don't know. It feels like the whispers know more about me than I do. Like, they've been there, watching, this whole time. The air in the room felt heavy again, like the day before, but this time it was worse. Their words hung in the space between us, thick and suffocating. After the session, I stayed behind, pretending to organize my notes. But really, I was trying to piece everything together. Why were they all hearing the same thing? How could their experiences overlap like this? Later that day, I went to see Dr. Hayes. I needed answers. I've noticed something strange, I began carefully. The patients, they're all describing the same phenomenon. The whispers, the memories. It's too consistent to be a coincidence. Dr. Hayes looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. It's not unusual for patients in group therapy to share similar experiences, he said almost dismissively. But this is different, I pressed. They're remembering things they shouldn't even know about each other. They're connecting dots that don't make sense. He leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses. Trauma has a way of blurring lines. Memory, perception, reality, it all becomes fluid. You know that as well as I do. His calm tone didn't sit right with me. And what about this? I asked, pulling out the journal. I flipped to the page with the message and set it on his desk. He glanced at it, then back at me. What about it? It wasn't there before, I said. I didn't write it. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible smile, he closed the journal and handed it back. Perhaps you're just tired, Clara. Working with trauma patients can have that effect. His response only fueled my suspicion, but I didn't push it. Not yet. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house seemed louder, every creak and groan of the old wood echoing through the walls. I thought I heard whispers too, soft and indistinct, but I told myself it was just my imagination. At some point, I decided to distract myself by going through the patient's files. That's when I found it. Each of them had been admitted to a place called Ravenwood Institute during their childhood. It wasn't mentioned in their intake forms here, but it was buried deep in their past medical records. The dates all lined up. They had all been there around the same time, though none of them had mentioned it during the sessions. My heart pounded as I dug deeper. Ravenwood wasn't just any hospital. It was a psychiatric facility for children, shut down decades ago under mysterious circumstances. The more I read, the more my skin crawled. There were whispers, no pun intended, of unethical experiments, of memory manipulation, of children being used as test subjects. I tried to breathe, to stay calm, but it felt like the walls were closing in on me. Then I saw it. Tucked in the back of Madison's file was a faded photograph. It showed a group of children standing in front of a rundown building. I scanned the faces, my stomach sinking. One of them was me. I dropped the photo, my hands shaking. That couldn't be right. I had never been to Ravenwood. At least, I didn't think I had. Suddenly, the whispers weren't just something I was hearing about in group sessions. They were here, in my room, swirling around me like a cold wind. And this time, they were louder. You know what you are. I couldn't stop staring at that photograph. My face, young, maybe 7 or 8, staring back at me from a time and place I had no memory of. I ran my fingers over the faded paper as if touching it would bring back answers. But nothing came. Just that overwhelming sense of wrongness, like the air itself had turned against me. Sleep was out of the question. The whispers in my head were louder than ever, their words jagged and disjointed. I couldn't make sense of them, but they carried the same ominous tone as the messages in my journal. I needed answers. The next morning, I confronted Dr. Hayes in his office. Why didn't you tell me they all came from Ravenwood? I demanded, slamming the photo down on his desk. He didn't look surprised. That made it worse. Clara, he said calmly, like I was a child throwing a tantrum. There's a reason we don't dredge up the past. It doesn't help the patients. I leaned forward, my voice shaking. You knew this whole time. You knew there was something connecting them, connecting me to all of this. What the hell is going on? He sighed, removing his glasses and setting them on the desk. Ravenwood was controversial, yes, but whatever happened there is irrelevant now. These patients are here to heal, not to revisit old wounds. You don't get it, I snapped. This isn't just their past, it's mine too. His expression flickered, just for a moment, but it was enough. He knew more than he was letting on. Before he could say another word, I stormed out. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, half listening to the group session as the patients shared their usual fragmented stories. The whispers, the dreams, the memories that didn't feel like theirs. I couldn't focus. My own thoughts were louder than anything they said. After the session, Madison lingered behind. She clutched her notebook tightly, her fingers trembling. "Clara," she said quietly, I think I remember something." I froze. "What is it?" She hesitated, looking around like she was afraid someone, or something, might overhear. "I don't know if it's real," she whispered, "but I keep seeing this room. White walls, bright lights. There were people, doctors maybe, and they kept asking me questions, over and over, about things that didn't happen. At least I don't think they happened." A chill ran down my spine. "Madison," I said carefully, "have you ever heard of Ravenwood?" Her eyes widened. "Why are you asking me that?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. That night, I decided to go where I wasn't supposed to. Dr. Hayes kept certain parts of the mansion locked up, but I'd seen him unlock the basement door before. I waited until the house was quiet, the patients tucked away in their rooms. Then I crept down the dimly lit hallway, the old wood creaking beneath my feet, and picked the lock. The basement smelled damp and stale, the kind of smell that clings to you long after you leave. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing rows of file cabinets and shelves covered in dust. And then I found it, a locked cabinet with the word Penumbra stenciled on it. My heart pounded as I pried it open with a crowbar I'd found on one of the shelves. Inside were stacks of folders, each marked with a name: Madison, Ethan, Sophie, Logan, Rachel, and mine. I opened my folder with shaking hands. The first thing I saw was a report, stamped with the Ravenwood logo. Subject, Clara Bennett. Age, 8. Diagnosis, dissociative identity disorder, experimentally induced. My breath caught in my throat. Experimentally induced? The report detailed sessions where they'd planted false memories in me, memories of a life I thought I'd lived. There were notes about how I'd reacted, about how they'd pushed me to the brink of a breakdown and then pulled me back, just to see if they could. I flipped through the pages, my vision blurring with tears. Then I saw the last line. Subject shows remarkable adaptability to implanted roles. Recommended for ongoing observation. The air around me seemed to shift. I felt a presence, something watching, and then I heard it. The whispers weren't just in my head anymore. They were here, in the room, swirling around me like a storm. Words overlapped, some loud, some soft, but all too familiar. "Who are you?" "You're not real." "They lied to you." I turned, and there they were, the patients. Ethan, Sophie, Logan, Rachel, Madison, all standing in the shadows, their eyes dark and empty. "What's happening?" I whispered, backing away. "You know what this is," Ethan said, his voice cold and detached. Madison stepped forward, holding her notebook. She opened it, and I saw my name scrawled across every page. "This isn't real," she said. "None of it." The whispers grew louder, deafening, as the walls around me seemed to melt into darkness. The files in my hands dissolved, the words on the pages turning into ash. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head. The truth crashed down on me, a wave I couldn't escape. I wasn't the therapist, I was the experiment. The walls around me seemed to close in, the dark shadows pressing against my mind like a vice. The whispers had grown into a deafening roar, each voice speaking a fragment of my life, none of it making sense. My name, my age, the lies they told me, the lies I told myself. I wasn't a therapist. I wasn't even Clara Bennett, not really. The patients, if that's what they even were, stood in the periphery of my vision, their faces pale and expressionless. Madison clutched her notebook like it was an anchor, her eyes wide with something between fear and pity. Ethan stared at me like he could see right through me. "Tell me this isn't real," I begged, my voice barely audible. Rachel stepped forward, her sharp gaze slicing through the haze. "It's as real as you want it to be," she said, her voice calm, detached. "But the truth? That's not something you can run from anymore." I staggered backward, hitting the edge of a desk. The files I'd found were gone, reduced to ash or maybe just another figment of this nightmare. But the memories they'd stirred were still there, clawing at the edges of my mind. "Ravenwood," I whispered, as if saying the name out loud would summon more clarity. "The experiments, the lies, what did they do to me?" "You already know," Logan said, his voice a low growl. "You've always known." The darkness around us shifted, twisting into shapes. Bright, sterile lights flickered to life above me, blinding and cold. The mansion melted away, replaced by a room I didn't recognize but somehow knew. White walls, steel tables, restraints, and me, a child strapped to a chair, wires running from my head to a machine that beeped softly in the background. "No," I said, shaking my head. "This isn't real." But it was. The voices grew louder, clearer now. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were doctors, nurses, cold and clinical as they recited numbers, observations, commands. "She's responding well to the implanted narrative," one of them said. "Push harder," another replied. "Let's see how far we can go before she breaks." The child in the chair, me, screamed, thrashing against the restraints as they fed lie after lie into her head, into my head. Memories that weren't mine, a life that didn't belong to me, carefully constructed like pieces of a puzzle. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head as the memories overwhelmed me. Every happy moment I thought I'd lived, every success, every failure, it was all a fabrication. They'd built me from the ground up, piece by piece, until I wasn't even sure who I was anymore. The room flickered again, and I was back in the mansion, or what was left of it. The walls were crumbling, revealing the dark void beyond. The patients were still there, watching me, but now their faces were different, familiar. They weren't patients. They were the fragments of my mind, the pieces of myself I'd buried so deep I didn't even recognize them anymore. Madison's fear, Logan's anger, Sophie's anxiety, they were all mine. Ethan's empty stare and Rachel's biting skepticism were just reflections of the person I'd become. "You're not real," I said, looking at them. "And neither are you," Rachel replied. The void began to consume the room, creeping closer with every passing second. The walls groaned, the floor beneath me cracked, but I didn't care. I couldn't fight it anymore. "What do I do?" I whispered. "How do I stop this?" "You don't," Madison said, stepping closer. She reached out, placing her hand on my shoulder. It felt real, solid. "You just face it, all of it, even the parts that hurt." The void swallowed the last of the mansion, leaving me standing in complete darkness. The patients, my fragments, faded one by one until I was completely alone. And then the whispers stopped. For the first time, there was silence. I stood there in the void waiting for something, anything to happen. And then I heard it, my own voice, soft and steady. "You are Clara Bennett. You are not just a lie. You're what's left." It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't even an answer. But it was something. When I woke up, I was sitting in the ruins of what used to be the mansion. The walls were scorched black, the furniture nothing but charred wood. The patients were gone. The files, the whispers, Dr. Hayes, it was all gone. But I was still here. I don't know what's real anymore. Maybe I never will. But I do know one thing. The whispers didn't win. Whatever they were, whatever I was, they didn't destroy me. As I walked away from Elysium Grove, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not peace exactly, but something close. A sliver of understanding, buried deep under all the chaos. And maybe that was enough. When my grandmother passed away, I wasn't expecting much to change. We weren't particularly close. She was always distant, the type of woman who spoke in clipped sentences and avoided eye contact. Still, I was her only grandchild, so when the lawyer called and told me I'd inherited her old house and its contents, I figured I'd drive down, sort through her stuff, and be done with it. The house itself was in the middle of nowhere, a creaky old Victorian that felt more like a museum than a home. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, but the memories came flooding back as I stepped inside. The smell of mothballs and something faintly sweet, almost sickly, hung in the air. Her furniture was all still there, covered in sheets like ghosts waiting to be revealed. I wasn't in a rush to start digging through her things, but the house felt like it was waiting for me, silent and watchful. I decided to focus on the living room first. It was packed with boxes and antique furniture, most of which had seen better days. That's when I found it. The mirror. It was tucked away behind a stack of boxes, leaning against the wall as if someone had been meaning to hang it but never got around to it. The frame was ornate, golden, and covered in intricate carvings, flowers, vines, and what looked like tiny, barely noticeable faces hidden in the design. It was beautiful in a strange, old-fashioned way, but there was something about it that felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. I pulled the mirror out and leaned it against the wall in the hallway. It was surprisingly heavy, and the glass was so clean it almost looked new. For a second, I thought I saw something move in the reflection, but when I turned to look behind me, the hallway was empty. "Must have been a shadow," I muttered to myself, shaking it off. I didn't think much of it until that night. After spending hours sorting through boxes and trying to decide what to keep and what to donate, I crashed on the couch in the living room. The mirror was still propped up in the hallway, just visible from where I lay. That's when I noticed it again. There was someone in the reflection. It wasn't me. The figure was too tall, too still. It stood motionless in the corner of the hallway, just out of the light. My heart started pounding, but when I sat up and looked directly at the hallway, there was nothing there. The air felt heavier, though, like the house itself was holding its breath. I told myself it was just my imagination. Long day, too much dust in the air, not enough coffee. I even laughed a little to shake off the nerves, but I couldn't bring myself to look at the mirror again that night. The next morning, I convinced myself to stop being ridiculous. I moved the mirror to my car, planning to take it back to my apartment in Chicago. It was a beautiful piece, after all, and worth keeping as a memory of my grandmother. That's when Marcus called. "You're taking furniture from that creepy old house?" he teased. "Bet it's haunted. That's how horror movies start, man." I rolled my eyes. "It's just a mirror. Nothing special." "Right," he said, dragging out the word like he didn't believe me. "Just don't blame me when it starts moving on its own or whatever. You know how these stories go." I laughed, but it didn't reach my chest. By the time I got back to my apartment, I'd almost forgotten about the conversation. I hung the mirror in my hallway, right next to the door, and went about my day. That night I saw it again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The reflection wasn't mine. It was a woman, pale and still, her dark eyes staring straight ahead. She didn't move, didn't blink, but I swear she was looking at me. When I turned to look at the hallway, it was empty. I told myself I was overtired, that it was some weird trick of the light. But as the days went on, more faces began to appear in the mirror. Men, women, even a child. All of them staring. And when I wasn't looking, they moved. At first I thought I was losing my mind. I mean, how could I not? Faces in a mirror that weren't there when I turned around. It sounded insane, but I couldn't deny what I was seeing. Every night, the mirror showed me something new. New faces, new positions. All of them locked in an unyielding stare that seemed to bore right through me. I tried everything to explain it away. Maybe the mirror had some kind of weird distortion, like a defect in the glass. Or maybe it was just the lighting in my apartment. But none of that accounted for the way the faces seemed to change positions, or the way they'd vanish entirely when I wasn't looking. The first time I saw the boy, I froze. He couldn't have been more than 10 or 11, his hair messy and his face smudged like he'd been playing outside. But his eyes, God, his eyes, they looked empty, like he wasn't really there. He just stood in the corner of the reflection, staring at me. When I turned to look down the hallway, there was nothing. The air felt heavy, though, like the weight of something unseen pressing against my chest. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, the faces, the stares. And when I finally drifted off, the nightmares started. In the dream, I was standing in front of the mirror, but it wasn't my apartment anymore. The room around me was dark, cold, and unfamiliar. The faces in the mirror were clearer now, and they weren't just staring. They were moving, walking, reaching out, their mouths forming words I couldn't hear. Then the boy stepped forward. He pointed at something behind me, and when I turned around, I saw it. A car speeding down a dark road, headlights cutting through the fog. There was a loud crash, and then I woke up, gasping for air. It took me a few minutes to shake the dream, but when I finally got up, I noticed something new in the mirror. The boy was gone, but there was a man now. His face was bruised, his eyes swollen shut, and just like before, he was staring straight at me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and started researching. Haunted mirrors, faces and reflections, supernatural artifacts. Most of it was garbage, forums full of people sharing ghost stories and urban legends. But one post caught my attention. It was about a woman in the 1980s who claimed to own a mirror that showed her the faces of the dead. She said the mirror was cursed, that it would bring her visions of accidents and tragedies. The post ended with a chilling detail. The woman died in a car crash, and the mirror was never recovered. The air around me felt colder as I scrolled through the comments. Most people called her story a hoax, but one commenter claimed to know her family. They said the mirror had been passed down through generations, always reappearing no matter how many times it was thrown away or destroyed. My hands were shaking as I closed the browser. It couldn't be the same mirror, could it? I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, but the next day, I saw the news. A man had been hit by a car downtown, just a few blocks from my apartment. His photo flashed on the screen during the broadcast, and my stomach dropped. It was the man from the mirror. I turned off the TV, my mind racing. There was no way this was real. No way the mirror was showing me things that hadn't happened yet. But deep down, I knew. The boy, the car crash, it wasn't just a dream. The mirror was showing me something. Desperate, I decided to get rid of it. I couldn't sell it. Who would buy something like that? So I took it down to the curb and left it by the dumpster. I didn't care if someone else took it. I just needed it out of my apartment. When I got back inside, I felt a strange sense of relief, like I could finally breathe again. But the relief didn't last. That night, I heard a crash from the hallway. My heart jumped and I grabbed a flashlight, creeping toward the sound. When I turned the corner, I froze. The mirror was back. It was propped up against the wall, just like it had been before. The glass was intact, but the faces were gone. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. And then I saw her. A woman's face, pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with terror. Her mouth opened as if she were screaming, but no sound came. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The nightmares, the faces, the boy, all of it came flooding back. This wasn't just a mirror. It was something else, something worse. I couldn't stop shaking. The mirror was back, sitting in the exact spot I'd left it before, like it had never been moved. No matter how much I wanted to ignore it, I couldn't. The woman's face was still there, her terror so vivid it felt like she was pleading with me through the glass. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak in the apartment made me jump. Every shadow seemed to shift just out of sight. When I finally drifted off, the dreams came again, clearer this time, more real. I was standing in front of the mirror, but instead of my reflection, I saw myself walking down a crowded street. Everything about the dream felt off, like the colors were muted and the air was thick. The woman from the mirror was there, standing on the curb, waiting for the light to change. I tried to call out to her, but no sound came. All I could do was watch as I bumped into her, just a slight nudge. Nothing serious. She stumbled back into the path of an oncoming bus. The sound of the impact jolted me awake. I sat up, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The image of her lifeless body wouldn't leave my mind. I tried to tell myself it was just a nightmare, but deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I turned on the news, dreading what I might see, and there it was. A woman had been hit by a bus downtown. Her photo flashed on the screen, and my stomach turned to ice. It was her, the woman from the mirror. My hands trembled as I turned off the TV. This couldn't be real. How could it be real? But it was. Somehow, the mirror wasn't just showing me people who would die. It was showing me deaths I caused. The thought sent me into a panic. What if I was next? What if every decision I made led to someone else's death? I couldn't let it continue. I grabbed the mirror, my reflection glaring back at me with a strange intensity, and carried it to the kitchen. I pulled a hammer out of the drawer and raised it high, ready to smash the glass into pieces. But before I could bring it down, something stopped me. It wasn't a sound or a voice, but a feeling, like the air around me had shifted. The mirror's reflection rippled, and suddenly I wasn't in my kitchen anymore. I was standing in a dark room, cold and empty. The faces from the mirror surrounded me, their eyes fixed on me with an almost accusatory glare. They didn't move or speak, but I could feel their anger, their pain. And then I saw myself. In the center of the room was another me, staring back at me with a twisted smile. His, or my, eyes were cold, hollow, and filled with malice. He stepped closer, and I felt my chest tighten. "This is who you are," he said, his voice low and venomous. "No," I whispered, backing away. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "But it did," he said, stepping closer. "And it will keep happening. You can't stop it. You can't stop me." I shook my head, gripping the hammer tighter. "I can break the mirror. I can end this." He laughed, a sound so cold it sent a shiver down my spine. "You think this is about the mirror? It's you, Daniel. You're the one causing this. The mirror just shows you the truth." The room dissolved around me, and I was back in my kitchen, the mirror still in my hands. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't quite right. The smile was there, faint but unmistakable. I screamed and brought the hammer down with all my strength. The glass shattered into 1,000 pieces, scattering across the floor. The room went silent, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of relief. But then I looked down. In every shard of glass, my reflection stared back at me. The smile was gone now, replaced by something worse, hunger. And then the whispers started. Did you really think it was that easy? The shards of glass scattered across the floor seemed alive, each one reflecting a twisted version of me. My face stared back, but it wasn't my face. Not really. The eyes in the reflection were hollow, dark, and filled with something I didn't recognize. Something evil. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with overlapping voices. They weren't just in my head anymore. They were everywhere, coming from the walls, the broken glass, the very air around me. "You can't escape," they said. "You are the mirror now." I backed away, my breathing shallow and ragged. I had destroyed the mirror, hadn't I? The hammer was still in my hand, its weight grounding me in reality, but the scene in front of me told a different story. The shards began to move, shifting across the floor like pieces of a puzzle rearranging themselves. I watched in horror as the reflections in the glass came to life. Faces, those same faces I'd seen before, stared back at me, but this time they weren't just watching. They were reaching for me. I stumbled, falling onto the floor as the shards pulsed with a faint, eerie light. The reflections weren't confined to the glass anymore. They were crawling out, pulling themselves free from the jagged edges like something being born. "Stop it!" I screamed, swinging the hammer wildly. The tool passed through them like smoke, and their forms grew more solid with every second. The boy from my nightmares stood before me now, his empty eyes filled with accusation. Behind him, the woman I'd seen hit by the bus, the man from the car crash. All of them surrounded me, their expressions full of blame. "This is your fault," they said in unison, their voices blending into a single, chilling tone. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "It wasn't me. I didn't mean to." "You knew," the boy interrupted, his voice cold and sharp. "You always knew." I scrambled to my feet, backing into the corner of the kitchen. The hammer slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was none. And then I saw it. Among the shards on the floor, one piece of glass still showed a clear reflection of me, but it wasn't me. Not anymore. The figure in the glass smiled, a slow, cruel curl of the lips that sent a chill through my entire body. It raised a hand, and I felt my own arm move against my will. The smile widened. "You can't fight this," it said, its voice like mine but darker, layered with something inhuman. "You were always meant to be this." The words echoed in my head, growing louder and louder until they were all I could hear. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head, desperate to block out the sound. "No!" I screamed, the word tearing from my throat. "I'm not like you." But the reflection just laughed, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to shake the very walls around me. And then it stopped. Everything went quiet. I looked up and the room was empty. The shards of glass were gone, the faces disappeared. For a moment I thought it was over. But then I saw the reflection in the window. It was me, my face, my body. But the smile was still there, sharp and wicked. My reflection stared back at me, tilting its head like it was studying a fascinating new toy. "You can't destroy what you are," it said. And then it moved. Not in the window, but in me. My hand lifted, unbidden, and I felt the cold weight of control slipping away. The reflection grinned wider, and I realized the truth. I wasn't fighting the mirror anymore. I was the mirror. The faces I'd seen, the deaths I'd caused, it had always been me. The mirror wasn't a cursed object. It was a part of me, a manifestation of the chaos inside. Breaking it had only set it free. Now I don't even try to fight it. The whispers are constant, guiding me, pushing me toward my next target. I see their faces in every reflective surface, in windows, puddles, even the gleam of a knife, and I smile. Because I know the truth now. I was never the victim. I was always the monster. It was one of those late summer afternoons in Millhaven, when the air feels heavy, like it's holding its breath. I'd come back to this little town after my mom passed away, thinking I'd settle her affairs quickly and get back to my life in the city. But life had other plans. I was out walking trying to clear my head when I noticed the posters. Bright, bold letters with a black background, announcing the Theater of Shadows. "Prepare to witness the unimaginable," it said. Beneath the words, there was a drawing of a stage with long, spindly marionette strings descending from above. It gave me a weird feeling, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Millhaven wasn't exactly known for excitement, so a traveling theater company showing up was a big deal. Later that day, I met up with my best friend Claire at the diner. She was already buzzing about it. "Did you see the posters? Everyone's talking about it. They're setting up a huge tent in the square." "Yeah, I saw. Kind of creepy though, right? The Theater of Shadows? What's that even mean?" She waved me off. "Creepy sells. Besides, Millhaven could use a little excitement. You're coming to the show, right? First one's tomorrow night." I shrugged. "Maybe. We'll see." I wasn't exactly feeling festive, but Claire had this way of roping me into things. Sure enough, the next evening I found myself standing in line with her and my younger brother Danny. The tent was enormous, its black fabric almost blending into the twilight. People from all over town were chattering with excitement. but something about it felt off. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of incense. The stage was minimal, just a backdrop of a dimly lit curtain and an ornate, old-fashioned lamp. The show started, and let me tell you, it was like nothing I'd ever seen. The marionettes were shadows, projected onto the curtain by the lamp. But they weren't ordinary shadows. They moved like real people, their gestures so smooth and lifelike that you'd swear they weren't just images. One shadow bent down to pick up an apple, and for a second, I thought I saw the fruit tumble across the stage. "Do you see that?" I whispered to Claire. She nodded, her eyes glued to the performance. "It's incredible." Even Danny, who usually couldn't sit still for 5 minutes, was completely mesmerized. As the show went on, the shadows became more elaborate, almost hypnotic. At one point, the audience was asked to stand, and I felt a strange pull, like the shadows were watching us as much as we were watching them. By the time the curtain fell, I couldn't tell if it had been 5 minutes or 5 hours. The leader of the troupe, a tall man with sharp features and a smooth voice, stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, spreading his arms wide, "thank you for joining us tonight, but this is only the beginning. Tomorrow we promise you an experience unlike anything you've ever known." His words sent a chill down my spine, but Claire was practically bouncing with excitement. "Tomorrow we're coming back," she said as we walked home. "I don't know," I replied. "Something about that guy gave me the creeps." "Come on, Alice, it's just a show, don't overthink it." I didn't argue, but as we reached our street, Danny suddenly stopped in his tracks. "Did you see them?" he asked, his voice low. "See what?" I said. "The shadows," he replied. "They didn't disappear when the lights went out. I saw them, moving." I tried to laugh it off, but his words stuck with me. Later that night, as I was sorting through my mom's things, I found an old, leather-bound journal. It was tucked away in a box of keepsakes, almost hidden. I flipped it open, curious, and froze when I saw the first entry. "The Theater of Shadows," it read in my mom's careful handwriting. "Beware the puppeteer." And just like that, the unease I'd felt earlier turned into something much darker. I couldn't sleep that night. My mom's journal sat on the edge of my bed, the words swirling in my mind like a storm. Beware the puppeteer. What did that mean? And why had she written about this theater decades before it ever showed up in Millhaven? The next morning I woke up with an ache in my chest. I had to know more. I grabbed the journal and started flipping through the pages. Most of it was mundane. Notes about her garden, errands, random thoughts. But every so often she'd written something cryptic. "They come to take, not to entertain. Shadows live longer than the light. Never look too closely." It didn't make sense. And the more I read, the more uneasy I felt. My mom wasn't the kind of person to believe in ghost stories or conspiracies. She was grounded, logical. If she had written these things, there had to be a reason. I decided to dig deeper. After breakfast, I headed to the library. Millhaven's library wasn't much, but it had a section of local history that seemed like a good place to start. Mr. Green, the elderly librarian, raised an eyebrow when I asked if he had anything on old traveling theaters. "Not much call for that sort of thing," he said, adjusting his glasses. "But there's a file on strange occurrences in Millhaven. Over there, third shelf." The file was thick, stuffed with yellowed newspaper clippings and handwritten notes. It felt like opening Pandora's box. As I sifted through it, one article jumped out. Disappearance of local residents linked to mysterious theater. The story was from 1974, about a town 2 counties over. A theater troupe had come through, much like the one here now, and after their final performance, 3 people were reported missing. No one ever found them, and the theater vanished without a trace. My stomach dropped. This couldn't be a coincidence. I was so engrossed that I didn't notice someone standing behind me until I heard a voice. "Find anything interesting?" I jumped, spinning around to see Claire. She smirked, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You scared me," I said, taking one of the cups. "You've been acting weird since last night," she said, sitting down. "What's going on?" I hesitated, unsure if she'd believe me, but the words spilled out anyway. I told her about the journal, the shadows, and what I'd found in the library. Claire listened, but I could see the skepticism in her eyes. "So, your mom thought a theater was cursed, and now you think this one's the same?" she said, tilting her head. "It's not just that," I said. "People disappeared, and Danny saw something last night. He said the shadows were moving after the lights went out." She leaned back in her chair, sipping her coffee. "Look, I'll admit the show was intense, but don't you think you're jumping to conclusions? I mean, it's just a performance." Her words made sense, but something deep in my gut told me otherwise. "Fine," I said, standing up. "Let's go back to the tent. I want to take a look around before tonight's show." Claire groaned but followed me. When we got there, the tent was eerily quiet. No one was around, and the black fabric flapped gently in the breeze. I walked around the perimeter, looking for anything out of place, and that's when I saw it. A door, half hidden behind some crates. "Help me move these," I said, pointing to the crates. Claire hesitated. "Are you sure about this?" I didn't answer, just started moving them. Finally, the door was clear. It was heavy, made of dark wood, and had no handle, just a small keyhole. "What do you think is down there?" Claire asked, her voice a whisper. "I don't know," I said, "but I'm going to find out." As if on cue, the door creaked open. I hadn't touched it. Claire stepped back, her face pale. Nope. This is where I draw the line. But I couldn't stop. Something inside me, curiosity, fear, maybe both, drove me forward. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, peering down a narrow staircase that led into darkness. "Stay here," I told Claire, though I wasn't sure she needed convincing. The air grew colder with each step. The walls were damp, and the smell of mildew and something metallic filled my nose. At the bottom, I found myself in a small room lit by a single flickering bulb. The walls were lined with shelves, and on them were objects, watches, necklaces, hats, ordinary things, but they felt wrong. My heart stopped when I saw one item in particular, a silver locket that belonged to my mom. I reached out to grab it, but a voice echoed through the room. "Curiosity can be dangerous." I spun around, but no one was there. The shadows on the wall seemed to shift, their shapes stretching and twisting. Panicked, I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back outside. "What happened?" Claire asked, but I couldn't form the words. As we walked away, I glanced back at the tent. The shadows under the fabric seemed to move, like they were watching us leave. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Whatever was happening here, it was tied to my mom, and I wasn't leaving Millhaven until I figured it out. I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on me. After what I'd found under the tent, every shadow in Millhaven seemed sharper, darker, like they were waiting for me to notice them. I tried to explain it all to Claire later that night, but she shut me down before I could finish. "Alice, you're scaring yourself," she said, pacing in my living room. "You found a creepy room. Okay, that's weird, I'll give you that. But it doesn't mean there's some grand supernatural conspiracy. Then how do you explain my mom's locket being there?" I shot back. "She never mentioned losing it. And the journal." "The journal doesn't mean anything," Claire interrupted. "Your mom was sick at the end, remember? Maybe she just wrote random stuff." Her words hit like a slap. I knew she was trying to calm me down, but she didn't get it. She didn't see the way the shadows moved, like they were alive. "Fine," I said, standing. "If you don't believe me, stay here. I'm going back to that tent tonight." Claire grabbed my arm. "No, you're not. This is how people end up on the news, Alice. Missing girl goes poking around a creepy circus tent. They'll be telling your story on some true crime podcast. Then come with me." She hesitated, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She didn't want to go, but she didn't want me going alone either. After a long pause, she nodded. We waited until well past midnight. The town was quiet, the streets empty except for the occasional flicker of a streetlight. Claire and I crept toward the tent, flashlights in hand. The place felt different at night. The black fabric seemed to pulse, almost like it was breathing. The air around it was unnaturally cold, even for summer. "This is such a bad idea," Claire whispered, but she followed me inside anyway. The main stage was deserted, just like earlier. The only sound was the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath our feet. I led her toward the hidden door, praying it would still be there. It was. The crates we'd moved earlier were back in place, but that didn't matter. I knew what was behind them now. Together we shoved them aside, revealing the door again. This time, it wasn't locked. "You don't have to come," I told Claire. "Like hell I'm letting you go down there alone," she replied, her voice shaking. We descended the stairs together, the darkness swallowing us whole. My flashlight barely cut through it, but I could still see the rows of shelves and the items they held. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling like fabric sliding against wood. "Did you hear that?" Claire whispered, gripping my arm. I nodded, my heart pounding. The sound grew louder, coming from the far corner of the room. Slowly, I turned my flashlight toward it. There they were. People. At least a dozen of them, standing perfectly still. But something was wrong. Their faces were blank, their eyes wide and unblinking. They looked like they were made of smoke and flesh, translucent in the dim light. "Oh my God," Claire breathed. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw her. My mom, or what was left of her. She stood among them, her locket glowing faintly against her chest. Mom? My voice cracked as I reached out, but before I could touch her, the shadows moved. They came alive all at once, swirling around the room like a storm. Claire screamed, and I grabbed her hand, dragging her toward the stairs. But the shadows weren't letting us go. They blocked the way, forming a wall of darkness that twisted and writhed. Out of the mass stepped Victor Blackwell, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. Victor tilted his head, smiling. "A masterpiece in progress. Every great artist needs subjects, don't they? Your mother was exceptional. And you, Alice, you have her fire. You'll make a fine addition to the show." "Over my dead body," I spat. Victor laughed. "That can be arranged." The shadows surged forward, surrounding us. I swung my flashlight wildly, but it barely made a dent. Claire was crying, her grip on my hand tightening. "Let us go," I shouted, my voice cracking. Victor stepped closer, and for a moment his shadow loomed impossibly large, stretching across the room. "You can't stop this," he said, "but you can make it easier on yourself. Accept your role. Become the star you were meant to be." I felt the shadows pulling at me, wrapping around my legs like vines. I thought about my mom, about Danny, about all the people who had disappeared. I couldn't let it end like this. "Claire," I whispered, shoving her toward the stairs. "Run." "No," she cried, trying to hold on. "Go!" I screamed, pushing her harder. She hesitated, but then the shadows surged again, and she bolted. Victor didn't even try to stop her. His focus was on me. "Brave," he said, almost admiringly, but pointless. The shadows tightened, pulling me to my knees. I fought against them, but they were too strong. "Let's begin," Victor said, his voice like a blade. As the darkness closed in, I saw my mom's face one last time. Her lips moved, forming a single word. "Run." I don't know how long I was trapped in that swirling darkness, but it felt endless. The shadows twisted and pulled, cold and suffocating, like they wanted to swallow me whole. Victor's voice echoed in my ears, smooth and detached, as if this was just another performance for him. "You'll make a perfect star," he said, his silhouette towering over me. I struggled, clawing at the air, but the shadows only tightened their grip. My flashlight had fallen somewhere in the chaos, leaving me surrounded by impenetrable blackness. My heart pounded, and for a split second I thought about giving up. Maybe it would be easier to stop fighting, to let go. But then I saw her. My mom's shadow, faint and flickering, stepped forward from the mass of figures. Her locket glowed faintly against her chest, and for the first time, I saw her expression. She wasn't blank like the others. She looked desperate. "Alice," her voice whispered, soft but urgent. It jolted me back to reality. She hadn't given up, not completely. If she could still fight, so could I. I reached out toward her, and as my fingers brushed the edge of her shadow, something strange happened. The locket's glow brightened, pushing the shadows around her away. They recoiled, hissing like steam against fire. Victor turned sharply, his confident demeanor cracking. "What are you doing?" he barked, his voice losing its calm edge. My mom's shadow stepped closer, and the light from the locket grew stronger. I realized it wasn't just light. It was warmth, a piece of her soul fighting back against the darkness. "Help me," I whispered, my voice shaking. The shadows surged again, trying to drown me, but my mom's light held them at bay. With a trembling hand, I grabbed the locket. The moment I touched it, a wave of heat shot through me. Like every ounce of strength my mom had left was flowing into me. Victor's face twisted in fury. "Enough!" he roared, raising his arms. The shadows around him expanded, forming a massive, writhing shape. "You can't stop this. You're just one girl." But I didn't feel like just one girl anymore. The warmth in my chest spread, burning away the fear and despair. I stumbled to my feet, clutching the locket, and faced him. "You're wrong," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I held the locket high, and its light exploded outward. The shadows screamed, their shapes unraveling like smoke in the wind. Victor staggered back, shielding his face. "No!" he shouted. "You don't understand. Without the shadows, they'll all fade." I hesitated, his words sinking in. The people trapped in the shadows, would they disappear too? My mom's voice whispered again, faint but certain. "It's the only way." Tears filled my eyes as I looked at her. Her shadow was already fading, her edges softening like an old photograph. "I'm so sorry," I whispered. She smiled, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could finally see her. "Be brave, Alice." With a deep breath, I turned back to Victor and the shadows. I poured every ounce of strength I had into the locket, focusing on its light. It flared brighter than ever, flooding the room with warmth. Victor screamed, his voice twisting into something inhuman as the shadows dissolved around him. One by one, the figures on the shelves flickered and vanished, their faces peaceful as they disappeared. My mom was the last to go. She mouthed something I couldn't hear, but I didn't need to. I knew it was goodbye. The room shook violently, the walls cracking as the last of the shadows burned away. Victor fell to his knees, his face pale and drained. "You ruined everything," he rasped. "No," I said, stepping toward him. "You did. You used people, twisted them into something they weren't. It ends now." The tent groaned, and I realized it was collapsing. I grabbed my flashlight from the floor and ran for the stairs. Victor didn't follow. He just knelt there, staring blankly as the shadows consumed him. When I burst out of the tent, Claire was waiting for me, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Alice!" she cried, running toward me. "What happened? What?" Before she could finish, the tent gave one final shuddering groan and collapsed inward, pulling itself into nothing. Within seconds, it was gone, leaving only a scorched patch of earth where it had stood. Claire grabbed my shoulders, shaking me. "What the hell just happened in there?" I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. I didn't know how to explain it. Instead, I just clutched the locket, the last piece of my mom, and whispered, "It's over." The days that followed were a blur. People in town talked about the disappearance of the tent, but no one seemed to remember the performances or the people who had vanished. It was like the theater of shadows had been wiped from existence. But I remembered. I carried the weight of it every day. Claire tried to get me to talk about it, but I couldn't. There were no words to describe what I'd seen, what I'd lost. All I knew was that my mom had given me the strength to end it, and I owed it to her to move forward. Sometimes, though, when the light hits just right, I see a flicker out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that doesn't quite match its source, and I wonder if it's really over, or if the theater of shadows is waiting, somewhere out there, for its next star.